Another reconstruction here. You see Thomas Farriner's baker's shop where the fire began in Pudding Lane. We're on day 2 of the fire, September the 4th, 1666, and it's really getting going now, as you can see and hear. The noise is an accurate thing as well. It's the church bells being rung backwards to warn neighbouring parishes of the fire spreading and to call for help from wherever it had come. And the music and drums are the trained bands playing to the firefighters to try and keep a bit of coordination and order. You see old St Paul's in the distance just starting to burn in flames. King Charles and the Duke of York helping to fight the fire. There will be some more of those soon. And the top of the monument of London rising from the ashes. Pudding Lane where the fire began. Join me for the next part now. September the 4th, 1666. Day 2 of the fire. And as you've just seen from the reconstruction, it was well raging by now. As Samuel Pepys had previously written, it had raged down all Fish Street Hill. St George's Hill was destroyed, and we can see here in this picture that old St Paul's is very much in flames. Samuel Pepys wrote about that as well, that it pained his heart to see the lead run down like rain from the roof of old St Paul's from the leads. And Samuel Pepys' old school, St Paul's School, that was burned too in the fire. We covered the fire itself and its starting in the previous episode. In this episode we're going to study and examine how the Londoners dealt with that fire. So here we go. You see here the fire starting, Tower to the right, Old St Paul's to the left, and London Bridge to the far left. Very primitive, but this is how the Londoners basically dealt with fire in those days, or any city or village, wherever dealt with fire. Great big hooks, and to pull the buildings down and drag the rubble out of the way, and that would create a fire break, stop the fire spreading from building to building. But unfortunately, as you've seen in our previous video and reconstruction, the streets of London were so narrow and the buildings so close together and all made from timber and lath and plaster, and they'd just previously gone through, or were going through, the hottest September they'd known for a very long time. So London was tinderbox dry. It was an accident waiting to happen. Then when the fire got going and the wind started, it created a wind tunnel effect through the streets and fanned the flames. And as they wrote, and Samuel Pepys wrote and others wrote, as fast as they could pull down the houses, the flames overtook them. We'll be visiting our main protagonists in the story, the way I've told the story, through the main protagonists, which are Samuel Pepys, of course, King Charles II, and James, Duke of York, his brother, who would later be the short-reigned King James II, and last but not least, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, one of London's most or more ineffectual mayors. Sir Thomas Bloodworth, who had first, when the fire started, gone, bah, a woman might piss it out, soon lived to regret those words. So now we're going to see how fire was dealt with. You see great big grappling hooks, and they'd latch that into the building, pull the buildings down. People are getting people out of the buildings by lowering them down on ropes, ladders and buckets, and a chain of buckets. And the men over to the left, over to the right, are the city fathers. They would sprinkle coins around, normally with a priest amongst them, to encourage people to fight the fire even harder than they would. Here we're seeing a 17th century fire engine, basically. A great big barrel filled with water, on wheels, on a cart, with a pump at either end, and a man with a long tube to point it at the fire. They weren't that effectual, and bearing in mind that it had been so hot, and London didn't have running water and fire hydrants like we've got, so they could only go so far with these as well. Here is a genuine 17th century fire engine. This is in a museum in the Netherlands, this is, but these are exactly what the Londoners would have fought the fire with. A man or woman on either end pumping away, and the original pipe and whatnot's gone from the centre now, but there would have been a pipe, as you saw in the previous image, with a man standing on top to point it at the fire. They also used things called squirts as well, which were like great big syringes that you'd put into a bucket of water, fill with water and squeeze into the window of a fire or to wherever you could get to it. Here we see a lot of Londoners just packed up what few things they could and fled. I mean, what else could you do? The carters and wagon men, who'd always been pretty badly treated by the rich beforehand, this was their time to get their revenge. And get their revenge they did. Old St Paul's on fire. You see over to the right, Old St Paul's School, Samuel Pepys' school. The Londoners were devastated to lose Old St Paul's. Old St Paul's had previously lost its spire in the latter 1500s, and it was in a very bad state of repair. By the time of the fire, there was talk about restoration or even pulling down and building new. So the fire made that decision for them. And here we see, and we're going to get back to our carters and wagon men and revenge. You see the Puritan man at the bottom left with his stovepipe hat on and his clean white collar. He's bundled his things up in a box and a bundle, and off he goes. Other people would get little wheelbarrows and put what they could in there. The carters men, whereas before the carters men would have to compete for the trade of the rich and be pretty badly treated and badly paid, now was their time to get revenge. Whereas before, a cart into the country may have cost you £1. Some carters said, no sir, I'll charge you £10. Some even charged £30 or £40, and the rich people said, I'll not pay that. And the carters said, well sir, then you'll see your things burn. It was rough justice, but that's the way London was. And our man on the horse in the centre is King Charles II, who acted very bravely. He earned himself the lifelong respect of the Londoners for this. He put himself about the fire in danger's way, helped man engines and things like that, and chucked coins around to encourage people to fight the fire, same as the Duke of York, his brother. They both acted very bravely in the fire, and it wasn't just propaganda afterwards that said so either. The ordinary Londoners weren't always that keen on the royals, so for them to really go on her, they did, about the way the king behaved. It's a testament to his bravery. Do excuse all my chiming clocks, sorry about those, but there we are. And as you see, we're looking here at Old St Paul's right in the centre without its spire, and that's going up in flames. They did try to save it. What happened as well, and this was a real tragedy, the booksellers and the cloth merchants all thought that St Paul's, being stone and such a large sturdy building, would be the safest place, and many of them stored their books, their wares, everything inside St Paul's, in the crypt and whatnot in St Paul's, and unfortunately watched all their things go up in flames. And don't forget, there was no insurance in those days. Some lost all. And when the monument to the Great Fire of London was built, that we saw in my previous video, some of the first people to throw themselves off of that monument, it became a bit of a suicide spot, but the first people to do that were those that had lost all in the fire. And you have to think how they felt about a monument to something that had taken everything away from them. They probably didn't like it, so it was kind of a message, probably, throwing themselves off of that. But here we are as a scene of fleeing Londoners, and King Charles, rather than fleeing, going into the heart of the danger and doing what he could. Here we see a more lifelike depiction to our modern eyes. This is taken from a film about the Great Fire of London. It's public domain stuff, so I can use these. But these are the men with grappling hooks. And as you see, they get them up into the windows, and you'd think, how the hell would they pull a house down? Our houses are built much stronger and sturdier and from brick mostly. All you'd have to do is get the beams and pull the beams, and once you got that going, it would pull it down. Then would come in the clearing men to drag everything away, and you'd have a big gap, like a set of broken teeth with 2 teeth gone in between the fire, and in that gap would create a fire break. But this fire was so fierce and ferocious that it burned as quick as they could pull down or pour water onto it. Samuel Pepys, Sir Robert Hooke, John Evelyn, many people remarked, and they thought that in those days people were very superstitious and more religious, and London was a very sinful place, and a lot of people thought that it was God's vengeance and that God fanned the flames and made them jump from roof to roof, because they couldn't figure out how a building that was 5 foot away from the next building to it, with no flame near that building, the roof would suddenly spring up. They didn't understand thermetics and how a fire spread like we did, but it was basically the great heat just making it jump from one place to another. As I say, everything was tinderbox dry. Many of the Londoners, including Samuel Pepys himself, fled to the river, to boats, and the boatmen made a roaring trade as well. They weren't quite as ruthless as the carters men, because they knew that their trade still needed to be got after the fire, and that many people wouldn't have forgiven it. So, but they did make a roaring trade, and they ferried many people over the river to the south bank. Samuel Pepys and his wife were on the river in a boat and saw London burning and felt the heat and the cinders all coming down, and it put the fear of God into him, and was taken to a little inn on the south bank where they watched London burn. More men with grappling hooks, and when the woman was with the bucket there, you'd have a chain of people with buckets, and they would do whatever they could. Here we see more people fleeing through the packed streets. It's a wonder that there weren't crushes. If there were, they've not been reported. Officially, only 4 people died, but way more. It's estimated that a lot more than that would have died. People who were crippled, homeless, drunk in the streets, wouldn't have been able to get away, and the heat being so fierce, it would have just completely incinerated them. And after the fire, everything was just levelled and flattened, and London was built on the ashes. That's why when you do archaeological excavations nowadays, you'll find 2 great layers of burning in the soil of London, one from the Great Fire and one from the Roman period, when Queen Boudica or Boadicea came and burned London and Colchester. You see these people fleeing here. The rich man at the front, he's a Puritan. You can tell by his white collar and his plain black clothing, and he's got some nice candlesticks and things he's off with. Other people just took whatever they could. Some people threw their things into the river to try and save them. And this is an illustration from the time that shows old London up in flames, and London Bridge over to the right, and over to the far right in the bottom are the lovely heads of traitors on stakes. So, yeah, as a warning to other people. It was lovely like that. The boats on fire in the middle of the river are a bit of artistic license. It didn't get quite that bad, but you know what humans are like. We tend to be a bit dramatic, and the Great Fire of London was very dramatic. Here we see an illustration of my favourite historical Londoner, Mr. Samuel Pepys, and his wife Elizabeth Pepys, maiden name de Saint Michel, in the Thames, and they're bowing their heads away from the flames because they felt like their hair was going to catch light. It was so hot, and they was rowed over the river to the south bank. And now we're going to visit our main protagonists, King Charles II, who commended himself very, very bravely during the fire. Really was praised, and rightfully so as well. He behaved in the way that a leader should behave, rather than fleeing from the danger, which a lot of people did, and a lot of people had done that previously in the plague, especially parish priests. Not all of them, but a good number of them were the first to go and the last to come back, and they weren't forgiven for that either. But King Charles, he was known as a merry monarch. He liked his women. It's Nell Gwyn, and it's very likely by the time he died that he was riddled with syphilis, but he was a good king. Here we have the Duke of York, James, Duke of York, brother to King Charles II. He also acted bravely. He was High Admiral of the Navy, and it was through Samuel Pepys going to the King and the Duke of York, and the orders being given, that Samuel Pepys and the Duke of York went to the Tower and ordered gunpowder to be released, and that gunpowder eventually, as we'll see in part 3 of our video, would be finally what stopped the fire. James, Duke of York, was an ardent Catholic. At a time in England when Catholicism was illegal, King Charles II, basically, he was kind of a Protestant, Church of England, but he was a secret Catholic, and he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, but he nodded the head to the state religion so he could keep his kingship and get on with his people. King James II, as he would later become, and he didn't reign for very long, was not like King Charles. He would not nod his head to the religion of the state, and he had to flee England because of his Catholicism, and that's when came in William of Orange and Mary, who was James's daughter, so that caused a family feud, as you can imagine. Here we have my favourite Londoner, right in the middle, Samuel Pepys, holding in his hand probably an extract of his diary. Over to the far right is Samuel Pepys' wife, Elizabeth, maiden name de Saint Michel. Over to the top left is you have a previous little insight into the year that had preceded the fire, which was plague. And it's not very nice, the image, but neither was what happened. And in the bottom left, you have King Charles II on his throne, and the two ladies below are Queen Henrietta Maria, King Charles II's actual wife, and Nell Gwyn, his favourite mistress, the Orange Lady. And our last protagonist in the little piece is the ineffectual and what people called idiotic Mayor Sir Thomas Bloodworth. Sir Thomas Bloodworth, when he was first informed about the fire, angrily informed the person for waking him up and informing him about the fire that a person or a woman might piss the fire out, and went back to bed. He would later regret that. When he eventually realised how bad it had become, he got on his horse and rode about the streets and started trying to give out orders that houses should be pulled down. Thomas Bloodworth was an ineffectual man who'd behaved very selfishly and cowardly in the plague by imprisoning himself in a box and refusing to have as little contact with people as possible. And people wouldn't obey him. They wouldn't pull down the houses because, don't forget, there wasn't insurance in those days, and people thought, well, if my house gets pulled down, he'll pay for it. And so they wouldn't obey him, and that was another reason why the fire spread. And when Samuel Pepys came upon Sir Thomas Bloodworth and his men in the street, Samuel Pepys wrote, and these are his exact words, I found him, and he screamed like a fainting woman, or cried like a fainting woman, that no one will obey me. I've given orders that houses should be pulled down, and none will obey me. So that's when Samuel Pepys took matters into his own hands and rode straight to Whitehall, or went straight to Whitehall and spoke to the King and the Duke of York. And that's when things actually started to be brought more under control. This is the monument. I'll show you this little bit now. This is the frieze, or the panel from the monument, that shows King Charles II among his people fighting the fire. we are. And I hope you all enjoyed this little episode, guys and girls. Join me again soon for part 3.